Hello, my name is Kelly Tebow, and I'm with the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders. I will be your organizer for this evening and would like to welcome you to our webinar on understanding and tracking implicit bias. Thank you all for joining us. Before I have my colleague introduce the speaker for tonight, I'm going to cover some housekeeping items with you. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please type it in the bottom of your question box and click send. You may send questions during the webinar. However, we will have Dr. Fuentes answer the questions at the end of his presentation. We will get to as many queries as time allows. In addition, tonight's presenter is available to take your questions on the Wednesday webinar blog, which is accessed from our homepage under the heading Programs. This blog will be monitored for the next 7 days. Feel free to look and post questions as often as you like. Answers will be archived for future reference. If you missed part of the presentation or would like to watch it again, an archived version will be posted to the website shortly. We value your input, and in order to expand the webinar experience in the future, we need everyone to fill the survey out when you exit the webinar. NJ Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the webinar coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Thanks, Kelly, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar on implicit bias. Before I introduce tonight's presenter, I'd like to take a moment to mention a couple of time-sensitive items. April 5th is the deadline for receipt in our office of the 2019 scholarship applications. Our scholarships are competitively offered to New Jersey high school seniors who will be attending either a 2- or 4-year college. Additionally, on April 15th, it's the last opportunity to receive a $10 per person registration discount for our family retreat weekend, which is being held this year on June 7, 8, and 9 at YMCA Camp Bernie. Families living with TS are welcome, and you do not have to be a New Jersey resident to attend. Registration can be done via our website. Now to the introduction of tonight's presenter, Dr. Milton Fuentes. Dr. Fuentes received his master's in psychology with a Latino psychology focus from Montclair State University in New Jersey, and his doctorate in clinical psychology from the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. He completed a pre-doctoral fellowship in clinical and community psychology at Yale University and secured postdoctoral training in epidemiology at Columbia University. He is the 2012 president of the National Latino Psychological Association, a former member of the American Psychological Association Committee on Ethnic Minority Affairs, and is the ethnic minority delegate to their Council of Representatives. Dr. Fuentes is a psychology professor and director of the Research Academy for University Learning at Montclair State University. He is licensed to practice psychology in both New Jersey and New York. Dr. Fuentes, welcome to our series, and I will now turn tonight's programming over to you.
Hi, thank you, Marty, and thank you, Kelly, for that introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and get started. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you this evening to share a topic that is of great interest to me. I just want to provide a few parameters around what I'm about to discuss. First of all, the current thinking in the field involving issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion basically informs us that there are a couple ways of thinking about this. initially, when we tried to train folks in the areas of equity, diversity, and inclusion, folks would typically take on a very didactic approach where audience would show up, the speaker would share information, and the hope was that people would become culturally competent. Research on that particular approach found that that approach was not very effective, and folks were not necessarily becoming more culturally competent. The current research in the field is finding that folks really do need to be actively engaged in information and research and activities related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so what the research is now suggesting is that people need to consider both the intrapersonal and interpersonal aspects of the training. We essentially need to start with ourselves when we're talking about issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'm recognizing that on the call today, I think we've got close to 90 folks, and we probably have a very mixed group. So today's presentation will try its best to, I'll try my best to kind of present the material somewhere in the middle, hoping that those folks who have preliminary knowledge can fill in the gaps, and those folks who have extensive knowledge in this area will, this will serve as a refresher.
Dr. Fuentes,
Yeah.
could you check your settings, because I'm seeing things that I should not. I'm seeing your next slide, your notes. Could you change it to, are you working on two screens?
No, I just see one screen here.
Okay.
Let me just see here. You should just see one slide. Opening comments?
Can you click on that little orange button on that on your control panel?
Yep. And
Okay.
I'm going to share my screen.
Okay. Can you click on, you have show my screen up?
People can see it. I'm sharing my screen.
Okay. Do go on your PowerPoint, go to File.
Okay. All right, I'm in File.
I'm looking at, I want you to go into PowerPoint mode, but not using the icon in the bottom right-hand side. Sorry.
Okay, let me go ahead and do that. Slideshow. Current slide. How's that, Kelly?
Oh, we're still getting, click down on your display settings.
How's that?
All right. I'm going to take control of the, no, not that one. You had it just for a second. You had it just for a second, where it's full screen for everyone. Click. All right. I'm going to take controls back, and I'm going, oh, it's working? Okay. That's it. We got it. So go ahead and go forward from here. Thank you. Okay,
great. Sorry, folks, for that interruption. So I wanted to just share with you really quickly that when it comes to discussing these types of topics related to diversity and multiculturalism, I just want to do a self-care prompt here. So sometimes when we have conversations related to issues related to diversity and multiculturalism, this can cause some distress. Some folks can feel psychological distress and physical distress. So I just want to encourage you to engage in some self-care over the next hour as I share with you different topics related to implicit bias. Professor Jackson at the University of Michigan has found that sometimes when we focus on aspects of our identity, people may experience some level of distress. I typically turn to mindfulness when I'm engaging in conversations that might cause me to experience some discomfort. So spending some time feeling the weight of gravity on my body against the chair or my feet against the floor, finding my breath, being mindful of my thoughts and being mindful of my feelings as I'm engaging in a conversation related to an issue related to diversity. And I also just remind myself that as I'm having thoughts and feelings throughout the conversation or the presentation, that they are just thoughts and feelings, and I try to return myself to the breath. So those are just some mindfulness exercises that I engage in to kind of keep the levels of distress down to a minimum. So just want to encourage you to take care of yourself in whatever way you need to throughout tonight's webinar. I want to share a little bit about my values related to issues associated with diversity and multiculturalism. First of all, as a clinical psychologist, I believe in change. So when we talk about issues related to implicit bias and some of the challenges associated with implicit bias, I do believe that it is possible for us to be aware of our implicit biases and engage in efforts to track them and monitor them. So I want to encourage folks to engage in proactive efforts. The other thing related to my value around change is that our implicit biases are a byproduct of something deeper. So keeping in mind that we want to think about things at the primary, secondary, and tertiary level. Primary level meaning that there are things happening in the larger society that shape our thoughts about individuals. And so we want to take a look at what are those mechanisms that contribute to our thought process, that contribute to our thinking around certain individuals, and how can we address those mechanisms at that level. In my mind, those are kind of primary mechanisms, and then there are the secondary issues, kind of the things that might mediate those primary mechanisms, that might contribute to why we develop implicit biases, and then of course thinking about it at a tertiary level where these mechanisms are in place and they are contributing to our thought process. And so my hope is that we can engage in efforts at all levels, both the both the primary, secondary, and tertiary level. The other thing I want to mention related to my values is the idea of thick narratives over thin narratives. In family psychology, specifically within narrative therapy, we talk about thick and thin narratives. Thin narratives are the very simple ways that we understand individuals, their sociocultural profiles, their identities, and it's the kinds of things that we might get in a soundbite, such as like a tweet or a quick news flash. Those are thin narratives. Thick narratives is when we take the time to develop a deeper understanding of individuals in society. So, for example, if I want to reflect on immigrants in the United States, and if I take a look at all the sound bites that we get related to immigrants, those would be deemed thin narratives. But if we take the time to really understand what drives a person to leave their country, come to the US, in what ways does US policy perhaps contribute to that behavior, really thinking through all those nuances, we start to kind of develop a thicker narrative with respect to immigrants. So when we have a conversation around implicit biases, I want to encourage all of us to see if we can embrace the thicker narratives that are associated with implicit biases. I'm also going to use terms tonight that are also very thin. So if I use the term like a Latinx individual, or a Black person, or a gay person, or a person with a disability, I'm recognizing that those are very simple terms that contribute to very thin narratives. when we think about individuals who subscribe or whose identities fit those categories that I just mentioned, we recognize that those individuals have richer sociocultural profiles, more nuanced sociocultural profiles. And so when I use a simple term like that, it's just a term of convenience, and I apologize in advance for using terms that are very, very simple. It's about using a term that allows me to kind of capture something in a very quick way, in a very convenient way, but I recognize the complexity and the nuanced aspects of a person and their identity. I also want to share that I have a deep appreciation for diversity. The research is clear around diversity. When we have folks who are different, who have differing perspectives, differing values, people in the room tend to work harder. We tend to be more creative and more innovative. So I have a deep appreciation for diversity and multiculturalism. I also operate as a practitioner scholar. I like to use the research to inform my framework, to inform my perspective on various psychological issues. And so everything that I'm doing tonight is based in theoretical models, is informed by the research, and that's the way I typically prefer to operate. I also prefer progress over perfection. When it comes to talking about issues related to diversity, again, it could be rather complex, and if people are hoping to have a perfect conversation around diversity, it's just not going to happen. It's complex, it's nuanced, it could be a little bit messy. So the best advice I can offer is getting started with the conversation, thinking it through, reflecting on ways that we can perfect it, integrate those reflections, and re-engage in the process until we move toward perfection. But if we're going to wait for perfection before we start addressing issues related to diversity, we may never get started. And the last thing I want to mention with respect to my values and our presentation today is I try to maintain a humble stance when I do this work. There is lots of good research being done in the area of diversity and multiculturalism. As I speak, things are being published and presented. And so it's difficult to stay on top of everything. Tonight's presentation is based on what I currently know. And I know some about the topic, and I have a lot more to learn. So I want to maintain some humility as we have this conversation today. There's some interesting research around what happens when individuals become experts in an area. They certainly become very confident as they present the material, but they also become closed-minded and dogmatic. So I'm mindful of that as I have this conversation with you around implicit biases, and hope that I can remain open-minded and flexible as we engage in this conversation. I just want to share this quick quote with you from a French philosopher. When it comes to having conversations related to diversity and multiculturalism, this quote is quite apt. Between what I think I want to say, what I believe I'm saying, what I say, what you want to hear, what you believe you understand, what you understand, there are at least 9 possibilities for misunderstanding. And I think currently, in today's time, we have lost the ability to have good conversations with each other. People have become so polarized in their positions that there isn't a space for us to have conversations. And I suspect that a lot of that is fueled by our implicit biases. Just before we get started, some fun or interesting facts about me. I listened to a podcast a few months ago about successful people, and started to engage in some of the habits that these folks engage in. So I usually start my day with 10 minutes of meditation. Actually, I start my day by making my bed. That's one of the habits of successful people. That's an immediate sense of accomplishment. Then I spend about 10 minutes meditating, and then I reflect on 2 or 3 things that I want to get done by the end of the day. And I think about how those 2 or 3 things connect to my bigger personal, professional goals. I recently read a book on teaching by James Lang called Small Teaching, which focused on little things that we can do as faculty members to improve our teaching. Found it to be a very helpful resource. One of my guilty pleasures is anything associated with National Public Radio, NPR. I especially appreciate Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. I had a chance to watch a broadcasting of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me at Carnegie Hall this past December. Really enjoyed that experience. I'm also a half marathon runner. I completed my 6th run last spring. I did the New Jersey half. I am one of 8 children. I'm number 7, and my name is Milton. When you look at the background of my name, it's an English name, and it means destined for success. So that's quite the namesake that my parents gave me. Just wanted to share a little bit more about me besides my professional credentials. Also, with respect to the conversation we're about to have this evening, I just want to think through some guidelines for us so that we can be in a space that allows us to learn. Some people talk about it as a learning or a brave space. Some people talk about it as a safe space versus a dangerous space. So if you look at the figure on the screen, I'm hoping that we can stay somewhere in the green, that we can remain aroused enough to be able to be in a space where we can learn something new. Usually when we're in a comfortable space, we're not very good at learning things. We're just kind of there in a very passive way. And then there are instances where the arousal is way too high and we're not able to learn. That's considered the danger zone. So my hope is that we can be in a learning zone together where the arousal is optimal for learning the information I'm about to share. If we were in a room together, I would ask you, what do we need to do to ensure that we are in a learning zone? In my conversations with folks across the country related to this topic, people have agreed to remain engaged, committed, and respectful. They've agreed to keep an open mind and to monitor their judgment. They've agreed to listen and learn, to keep the focus on themselves rather than sharing with folks what we think they should do. Rather than doing that and sharing advice, we typically ask folks to focus on their own experiences, their own strengths and hope. I'm hoping that we can respect privacy and then also that we can value and model imperfection as we engage in this conversation this evening. You're going to see a chat box in the console related to the webinar. So if you see the chat box, I'm going to ask you now to just spend a minute sharing with each other what you know or what we know about implicit bias. So why don't we start with that question? So what do you know about implicit bias? Go ahead and if you can, type something in that chat box. If you're not capable of typing something in the chat box, or you're not able to see the chat box, go ahead and grab a piece of paper and pen and just write down what you know about implicit bias. And I'm beginning to see folks typing in. So go ahead and post in the question box. Give folks a few minutes to do that while Kelly gathers all the information for me. Okay, so we've got some folks here noting that implicit biases are unconscious, they're unintentional. It's in operation at all times, sometimes how we make sense of our world. Somebody says here, biases that a person is not aware of. We learn from life experience, been nervous, I need to learn more. Okay, thank you, folks, for sharing your initial associations with implicit bias. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and continue. I've used the term implicit bias a few times now. Let me give you a working definition. This is a definition that was provided by two experts around the area of implicit bias, Greenwald and Banaji. Implicit bias is traces of past experience that affect some performance, even though the influential earlier experience is not remembered in the usual sense. That is, it's unavailable to self-report or introspection. So things that we were exposed to early on in our lives, TV, parents, friends, teachers, newspapers, things that we were exposed to that now inform the way we think. And that those thoughts and that process may inform the way we behave. So that's our working definition of implicit bias. 5 key characteristics. By the way, the Curran Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity releases a great report every year that summarizes the latest and greatest around implicit bias. And in the 2017 report, here's what they had to share about implicit bias. Implicit bias is unconscious and automatic. It's pervasive, meaning everyone has implicit biases. They don't necessarily adhere to what we consciously or actually believe, which is also known as explicit biases. They have real-world consequences in important areas such as employment, healthcare, legal matters, and education. And they're also malleable, suggesting that they can be unlearned and substituted with new mental associations or unbiased responses. So those are key characteristics associated with implicit bias. One byproduct of implicit bias could be microaggressions, and specifically racial microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal and nonverbal and environmental slights, insults, invalidations, and indignities, whether they're intentional or unintentional, which are directed toward people of color. Again, they're unintentional, they're outside of one's awareness. We've been typically socialized out of explicit bias, so if we have a particular thought about a particular group, we may not say it out loud, although some folks have argued that the current political climate has created a space for folks to kind of say what's on their mind about particular groups. But generally speaking, if we have a particular thought about a group, we may hold back about sharing it with folks. I want to just step out of the PowerPoint for a second, and I want to show you an example of what a microaggression might look like.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, well, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean. But I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Kamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place in my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American.
Just going to pause this for a second. Hopefully you got kind of a sense of what was operating there. just an example of a racial microaggression. I've gone back to showing my screen. Kelly, can you just let me know if you could see my screen okay here?
No, I'm still seeing the video.
Let me bring
You
it
don't?
back here.
Okay, no, don't. Do you see his? Oh, okay. Marty is seeing the split screen again instead of your full screen.
Okay, let me go ahead and bring it back here. Okay, Marty, let me know if that works.
It's got it.
Excellent. Okay, great. All right. So the good news about implicit biases is they can be unlearned. The researchers, the scholars who study here implicit bias have found that if implicit orientations have their basis in overlearned associations, then they should be amenable to change. In other words, unlearning. So let me bring this back to you now that you're comfortable with the chat box. Go ahead and type in the chat box, what can we do to dismantle our biases? If you find yourself engaging in certain strategies for dismantling your biases or addressing your biases, go ahead and share them really quickly in the chat box. What do you do to dismantle your biases? I'll give you a minute to do that. Seeing some great stuff here. So one person mentions that they expose themselves to new and different experiences. They raise their awareness. They're curious. They become aware and intentionally try to change. One person mentions here becoming more self-aware, reflective, becoming more educated, ceasing to be judgmental, move away from one or two-dimensional understanding of others and ourselves, educating ourselves about different groups. This is great, folks. Thank you. Keep the comments coming. If anything else comes to mind, go ahead and educating ourselves about different groups. Great. Thank you for that, folks. All righty. So let's talk about things that we can do to reduce our race-based bias. So these are all evidence-based approaches or research-informed approaches or strategies for reducing our race-based bias. I'm going to unpack each one for you. Before I do that, what I'd like us all to do is just really spend some time thinking about how you can actually use these strategies in your own life. The more specific we can be, the deeper connections we can make around these strategies in our own lives will ensure that we can actually start engaging in these strategies. It'll facilitate that process. It'll tighten that process up. So I just want you to really reflect on how you can use these strategies in your own lives. I also want you to keep in mind that as I present each strategy, that they are or can be interrelated. They can inform each other. So when I talk, for example, about the strategy associated with contact, and I'll unpack that in a little bit, contact can also lead to individuating, and perspective taking. And I'm going to discuss these three strategies in a bit, but I just want to illustrate that they can inform each other. And so by doing one, we can start the process of doing the other one. And certainly, the more we do it, the easier the strategy will become. So the first step to addressing our implicit biases is to bring awareness to these implicit biases. And I want to invite folks to visit Project Implicit. This is a program that comes out of Harvard University, where folks get a chance to complete a number of computer-based inventories that assess your implicit bias around race, ethnicity, gender, disability, age, sexuality, and weight. And so that's the first step. The first step is to bring awareness to our implicit biases. Then once we have a sense of our biases and we find ourselves engaging in stereotypical responses to individuals in society, then we can start to do what's called stereotype replacement. This strategy involves replacing stereotypical responses with non-stereotypical responses. It involves recognizing that a response is based on stereotypes, labeling the response as stereotypical, and reflecting on why the response occurred. So what I typically do is, like, if I'm having a conversation with somebody and I find myself having a particular reaction to that person, maybe I'm getting frustrated, annoyed, feeling, discomfort around that person, and I find myself having kind of negative thoughts about that person, that's a trigger for me to stop and reflect on what might be going on with this person and their identity, and is there an aspect of their identity that's causing me to have this reaction? So really listening to either our cognitive cues or our physiological cues within our body, and wondering whether these cues are associated with an aspect of this person's identity. Once that's happened and we take a look at the cognitive cues or the stereotypes that we might be generating with this person, we want to spend some time recognizing that it's a stereotype, labeling it as a stereotype, and thinking about ways to try to avoid that stereotypical response in the future. Another strategy that can help us manage our implicit biases is called Counter-Stereotypic Imaging. And this strategy involves imagining in detail a counter-stereotypic other. These others can be abstract. So let's say we have a stereotype with Black people. We might think about smart Black people. We might think about famous Black people, such as Barack Obama, or non-famous Black people, such as a personal friend. What this allows us to do is it allows us to have quick access to counter-stereotypical information or counter-stereotypic information around particular individuals. And the more we do this, the quicker our access to this data is. Another strategy for reducing implicit bias is individuation. Basically, this relies on preventing stereotypic inferences by obtaining specific information about group members. What that helps us do is helps us evaluate members of the target group based on personal rather than group-based attributes. So rather than saying, oh, all members of a particular group are like this, we can do counter-stereotypic imaging, where we think about individuals who don't fit that stereotype, and at the same time, when we encounter individuals from a particular group, we can spend some time getting to know them in a deeper way. For example, I'm gonna provide all these resources with you, but in this link, I'm gonna bypass the link because it seems like whenever I get out of the PowerPoint, I have to do some kind of logistical stuff. So I'm gonna stay in the PowerPoint. But in this link, this introduces individuals to American Indians in a Canadian community and how they're typically depicted and who they really are. And it really allows you to kind of develop a deeper sense of that individual. I'll provide all of these links to you so you can have access to them and spend some time with them. A colleague and I developed what's called a sociocultural profile, where an individual can think about their membership in these various sociocultural categories, like what's a person's race, ethnicity, class, gender and sex, religion, sexual orientation, ability and disability. It also kind of helps you think about, does your membership in these categories give you power and privilege? Is society set up in a way that you benefit from your membership in these categories, or is society set up in a way that you don't benefit? There are actual obstacles or barriers from allowing you to access certain aspects of society because of your membership in a particular category. And so this is a great way to develop a deeper understanding of an individual. It allows you to individuate, get to know people better, so that you move away from, or we move away from, group-based evaluations and develop a deeper appreciation for individuals in a particular group. Another strategy for in reducing implicit biases is called perspective taking, and that is thinking about being a member of that particular group, taking on a first-person perspective. In other words, what must it be like to be an immigrant in society, to be gay in society, to be disabled in society? Really spending some time wondering what it must be like to be an individual of that particular group. And what the research has found is that when we take time to understand that person's perspective, we develop psychological closeness to that particular group. It also prevents us from going to the default, which is the automatic group-based evaluations. So thinking about what it's like to be a member of that group allows us to be closer to that group and moves us away from our automatic group-based evaluations. This is another great link that I want you to visit. This is Jane Elliott is a well-known researcher who did an activity called Blue Eyes and Brown Eyes with kids, where kids with blue eyes were treated a particular way and kids with brown eyes were treated a particular way. And it really helped people develop a deep understanding what it feels like to be different in society. And in this particular clip, she asked the audience to stand up if they wouldn't mind being a Black person in society. And nobody stands in the group. And she says, well, maybe you didn't understand me. I'd like you to stand up if you wouldn't mind being a Black person in US American society. And again, nobody stands. And then she spent some time kind of thinking with the folks in the room why it was that nobody stood. It's a great way to help individuals develop perspective for a particular group. So I'm gonna, again, I'll share this resource with you so you can have access to it and you can check it out on your own time. And the last strategy that I want to share with you is increasing opportunities to have contact. Something I asked you earlier, what are some things that you can do to reduce your implicit biases? Some folks talked about having contact or engaging in activities that they ordinarily wouldn't engage in. This is another great way to reduce one's implicit bias, to seek out opportunities to encounter and engage in positive interactions with outgroup members. What this does is it alters the cognitive representations of that group. It alters the way we think about individuals in that group, and it eventually leads to an improvement around how we evaluate that group. The challenge with contact is related to people being willing to engage in conversations with folks who are different. What Claude Steele has found in a number of elegant studies that he conducted was that when we are in a room with individuals who are different from us, we tend to shy away from engaging in a conversation with them because we're afraid that we might say the wrong thing. And as a result of that, he calls that identity threat. So our identity gets threatened, and therefore we tend to shy away from having conversations or having contact with people who are different with us, which creates quite the conundrum, right? Because if one of the strategies for reducing implicit bias is having contact with people, but we're afraid to have contact with people because we're afraid we might say the wrong thing, that creates quite the tension for us. So in a series of studies, what Claude Steele found was that if we're willing to keep this prompt in mind, keep in mind that tension is natural in a conversation about racial profiling, in a conversation with somebody who's different from us, right? Whatever, you fill in the blank. It's typically difficult for everyone. Treat these conversations as a learning experience. That is, try to learn about the issue and more generally about how to talk about charges with people who might have differing perspectives. What Claude Steele found was that when people received this prompt, they were more likely to engage in conversations with people who are different. So in other words, keep an open mind, be willing to listen and learn, and that is going to allow us to have the contact that we need to have with individuals who are different than us. I'm going to be wrapping up in a few minutes, but this is a self-reflection exercise that you might want to consider doing at home. So the first thing is, consider a bias that you have. You either could be aware of it, or you can do the implicit association test. And then once you have identified your biases, come to this self-reflection exercise. Wonder about what concerns you about this bias and what ways can it be problematic. Think about the last time this bias, this stereotype was engaged, and what can you do to ensure that it's not engaged in the future? Think of individuals from this group who don't fit the stereotype, who aren't associated with the bias, and generate a list of individuals who don't fit the stereotype. What else do you know about this group? What's positive about this group? Imagine yourself as a member of this group. What would it be like? What challenges might you encounter? And reflect on opportunities that you might engage in to be with members of this group, to be exposed to members of this group. This is just a self-reflection exercise these are questions, as you probably have deduced at this point, that are associated with the strategies that I introduced you to in this presentation. While you're engaging in this process, I want you to keep in mind that this can be rather taxing. So be sure to take care of yourself, engage in self-care in these various spheres so that you can be sure to engage in self-care. What I want you to do right now, again, since we've been doing a little writing today, this evening, I would like you to take one of these prompts, consider one of these prompts. With respect to today's webinar, complete one of these sentences and go ahead, if you feel comfortable, go ahead and type it in your chat box. I learned that, I was pleased that, I was disappointed that, or I was surprised that. Pick one and complete the sentence and go ahead and put that in the chat box so I can take a look at what you've learned. Of course, I'll keep your answers anonymous. I'll just read what I'm seeing, but I won't mention your name. I'll wait here for a second to see what folks have to say. So with respect to today's presentation, I learned that, I was pleased that, I was disappointed that, I was surprised that. Pick one sentence and complete it, and go ahead and post it in this box here. All right. I was pleased that as a professor of developmental psychology, I kind of intuited much of this information. Excellent. I was pleased that what I know and feel about implicit bias is on target with presentation. Wonderful. I learned that there are strategies that I can use to address implicit bias. I appreciate you shared the resources with us and look forward to researching further. I was pleased that implicit bias can be changed. Wonderful. Thank you so much, folks, for engaging in this conversation with me. I'm going to turn it back over to Marty and Kelly, who I believe are going to facilitate a question and answer period with this webinar.
Okay, here I am with some questions. Thank you. I'm going to launch right into this. So I have a question from a middle school teacher. Individual says, I've encountered students out of school who behave differently than they do inside school regarding diversity and bias. Should I call them out on their comments at the time? Should I let it go or deal with it in school?
Thank you for that question. I think it's incredibly important. You know, youngsters are part of our job is to let youngsters know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and it's our job to set the tone. And so if somebody makes a comment that is inappropriate, disrespectful, we do want to spend some time calling attention to it, letting folks know that it's not appropriate, trying to understand where it's coming from, engaging folks in some critical thinking. Is there any evidence to support that particular attitude, that particular statement? Understanding where it might come from. We don't want to, so within the psychological field, there's a model called motivational interviewing. And we can use aspects of motivational interviewing to facilitate conversations. So we might want to ask somebody, you know, what's the not so good side of what you just said, right? Because they're saying it, so they must think there's some value to it. So we want to spend some time asking them, what's the not good side? What are the cons of what you're saying? How might what you're saying be problematic? We can have that conversation privately. We can bring it back to the group in a respectful way so that everybody can benefit from this information. But it's part of our job as adults, as teachers, to set the tone and let folks know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
It's interesting because actually I have a couple questions along this line. But in this particular case, so middle school teacher, I don't know, maybe they're at a mall or something, movie theater, whatever. So do you stop then and kind of ask that question? Or do you let it go and deal with it in school and make it a teachable moment then or in school? Like, what's kind of the way? You don't want to embarrass the kid, but at the same time, so what would be, you know, your thinking on the appropriateness of saying something then versus maybe bring it up when that kid is in class and not single him out, but make it part of a lesson?
Yeah, no, again, you know, these are all very particular situations with particular kids who I don't know. Generally speaking, I think if there's a way of bringing this conversation up in a lesson, in a particular conversation in class, through a particular teaching moment, I think it's like when I think of myself and my nephew, for example. If he and I go to the movies, and I see the way a particular group is being depicted. So sometimes I'll see that in the movies, men are always stepping in to save the women. And so I will be, after the movie, I will spend some time kind of chatting with my nephew about why do you think that the director felt a need to create this scenario where men save women? This woman in this movie seemed quite capable. She seemed smart. She seemed to have skills. And so really kind of spending some kind of natural time with my nephew, thinking through some of the biases that were being promoted in that particular movie. So if there's a natural way of doing it, absolutely. But I think if you're in class and somebody makes an inappropriate remark, it's important to say that's not appropriate that's not appropriate, period. And we certainly don't speak that way here. And then if there's a way of naturally kind of integrating some of these conversations into the lesson plans, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. But it is tough in a social setting like, is in this question to manage that well, I think, without having it go just really bad for the kid. So we have a question about, a request rather, for you to talk a little bit more about, so in referring the page about prompts that we could use at the start of a conversation and explain a little bit more about them. Is that something you could talk a little bit about here?
Sure, absolutely. So if we're going to have a conversation about a particular topic that might make people uncomfortable, saying to folks, again, related to that prompt. So listen, having a conversation about this can be difficult. It might be uncomfortable. I just want to encourage everybody to keep an open mind and see what you can learn from this conversation. Something as simple as that gives people permission to engage in the conversation. So if you are going to engage in a conversation with students, for example, or individuals around issues related to equity, diversity, inclusion, you always want to have some conversation guidelines, like I had very early on in the presentation. So listen, we're about to have a conversation. It might be difficult for some of us in the room. Keep an open mind and see what you can learn about it. What do we need to put in place to allow us to have this conversation comfortably? And then put all the guidelines up on the board. Let's be respectful. Let's listen. Let's respect privacy, so on and so forth. And then you have the conversation.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I have a question about resources. It's a little long, just let me get the sense of it. So, what are some good resources for learning about how common implicit bias negatively impacts students of various races? And there's actually a second part to it. What are ways to create a buy-in for teachers to learn about and identify their own implicit biases?
Yeah, two very rich questions. So the Curran Institute, as I mentioned earlier, Curran, K-I-R-W-A-N Institute, they release a report every year that summarizes the research around implicit bias. And there they really talk about how implicit bias plays out in healthcare settings, in education settings, in legal settings. So if you're trying to understand the implications or ramifications associated with implicit bias, please check out one of these reports published or authored by the Curran Institute. The second part of the question, how do we get buy-in? I'm actually driving down to Central Jersey on Friday to do 2 one-hour presentations around implicit bias with teachers. So this is after I did a 3-hour training with administrators in this particular district. So I met with the principal, vice principals, guidance counselors. So in terms of buy-in, it's important that it start from the top. There needs to be buy-in from the top with principals and other administrators. And then, of course, that will make its way down to teachers. With respect to teachers, we want to assess teachers' goals and values. Teachers are in the classroom trying to actualize particular goals, right? Teachers are in there because they want their students to learn. They want to set up optimal settings for learning. If they realized that their implicit biases prevented them from accomplishing this goal, their implicit biases prevented them from creating an optimal setting, that's going to create what I call discrepancy. And that discrepancy hopefully will lead to people becoming open and getting that buy-in that you're referencing in your question.
Okay. I have a question from someone who asked that your answer included that institute. Could you repeat the name? She didn't quite get it.
The Kirwan Institute, Kirwan.
Got it.
I believe we're going to be sharing a PDF of this PowerPoint, so a lot of the resources will be in there as well. And the Kirwan Institute is referenced in the PowerPoint.
Okay, excellent. I have a question about biases in kind of generalized. So basically is that biases, for all purposes, has been around for years. And this individual is saying that, she heard stories about how difficult it was, for example, for the Irish to find jobs in the early 1900s. She says there were signs in businesses that said no Irish may apply. What she's getting at, though, is ultimately they assimilated into the community and the bias seemed to diminish. So wouldn't you think that assimilation is a very important part of getting past a bias?
So that is that's a question that has an incredibly complex answer, and I happen to do research around what's called cultural integration. When people migrate into this country, they can do one of four things. They could assimilate, they can separate, they can integrate, or they can marginalize. The research has found that integration, in other words, holding on to aspects of your culture of origin and embracing aspects of the host culture, that's called biculturalism or cultural integration, that is the one option that is associated with the most positive psychological outcomes. And assimilation, on the other hand, isn't necessarily associated with the most positive psychological outcomes. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that people will eventually grow accustomed, outgrow it. I personally think that as a society, we need to learn from the errors that we've engaged in. If we treated the Irish poorly, shame on us. We can learn from that, and we can think about how we can treat future groups better. We, as a country, in my mind, as a country, we are who we are because of the diversity that we have in this country. We are innovative. We are leaders. We are hard workers. We're critical because of that diversity. And I want to do whatever I can to embrace that diversity and not dismiss that diversity or challenge that diversity or hurt that diversity.
Okay, that's a good point. I'm thinking of the neighborhood I grew up in, and there was an English area that today, this is years later, that kind of English area is still there, and that's where you go to get the best pork pies you've ever had. So those areas like that are wonderful contributions to the community.
Absolutely.
So that's a silly story, but when I go back home, that's where I go to get my pork pie.
You'll have to let us know so we can also get some.
Okay, they're only open for 4 hours on a Saturday. You got to be quick. All right. Can you relate some of this that you've talked about tonight specifically to some of the situations we have with kids with TS?
Absolutely. I think if I'm imagining that this particular group faces biases on an ongoing basis, and so while we want to help individuals from this group certainly develop strategies to respond to these biases. At the same time, we want to help the greater society be mindful of their biases and diminish their biases or address their biases, so that individuals from this group can flourish and thrive without the challenges associated with with these biases. So I think those are my immediate ways of kind of making these connections.
And that, of course, would be something, too, that should strongly be communicated in a classroom situation by the person at the front of the room.
Absolutely. Yeah, that person sets the tone. And again, if we want somebody to change their attitude, confronting and challenging and shaming is not going to help, right? Really getting people to kind of think through their stereotypes or their biases is what we want here. To unpack it, to develop empathy, those are the things we know will work. Shaming and challenging, confronting, that might actually backfire.
I couldn't agree more. Well, I think we're over our time, so I think I'm going to wrap it up here and send everything back to Kelly for her to do her finish. Thank you, Dr. Fuentes. It was a great presentation.
My pleasure, Marty. Thank you.
Thank you for joining our webinar on understanding and tracking implicit bias. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is now open and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our website. Our next presentation, Tourette Syndrome, Stop Your Tics by Learning What Triggers Them, is going to be presented by Sheila Rogers-Demare and is scheduled for April 17th, 2019. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Fuentes, for your presentation, and thank you for everyone for attending. Good night.
My pleasure, Kelly. Thank you.